The world is on fire right now, and most people watching the news from their living rooms in America have absolutely no idea how interconnected all of this really is. What you're watching unfold in the Middle East and what's quietly happening across the Pacific with China and Taiwan, these are not separate stories. They are chapters of the same book, and that book is being written at a speed that historians will struggle to process decades from now. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a series of strikes against Iran, stating their aim was to induce regime change and destroy its nuclear and ballistic missile program. And since that moment, the world has not been the same. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow body of water through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows, has become the most contested piece of geography on the planet. Oil prices have surged more than 50% since the war began, and according to the International Energy Agency, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz represents the biggest oil shock in history. That hits you at the pump, that hits your grocery bill, that hits your retirement account. And while Washington talks about maximum optionality and Operation Epic Fury, Beijing is watching every single move, taking notes, drawing conclusions, and sending warnings of its own over Taiwan that most Americans are simply not hearing. What we are living through right now is not just another Middle East conflict. This is a fundamental restructuring of global power, and you deserve to understand exactly what is happening and why it matters to you, your family, and the future your children will inherit. So let's start at the very beginning. Not the beginning the mainstream media gives you with its maps and its missile counts and its nightly body count updates, but the real beginning. The beginning that requires you to understand what kind of world we were living in before February 28th and what kind of world we are now entering, because this shift didn't come out of nowhere. It was built brick by brick over decades of geopolitical maneuvering and understanding that architecture is the only way to truly understand what is collapsing around us right now. Beginning in late December of 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests erupted inside Iran. Originally driven by economic collapse and crumbling infrastructure, they escalated into explicit calls for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic itself, the largest protests Iran had seen since the revolution of 1979. Now, think about what that means. Here is a government that had been holding together for over 40 years through iron-fisted control, through proxy wars, through sanctions, and through the constant external pressure of American and Israeli strategic hostility, and its own people were rising up against it in numbers that hadn't been seen in living memory. The regime responded with massacres. The US-based human rights activist news agency documented at least 7,000 deaths, while various non-government affiliated Iranian health officials gave figures as high as 32,000. These are not small numbers, these are catastrophic numbers. And yet, rather than allowing the internal process of change to work itself out, rather than letting the Iranian people chart their own destiny, Washington and Tel Aviv saw an opportunity and chose to act on it militarily. According to the Washington Post, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had multiple phone calls with Trump urging him to attack Iran, and Trump's decision to launch military strikes came after sustained lobbying by both Saudi Arabia and Israel. Let that settle in for a moment. The decision to launch one of the most consequential military operations in American history was shaped in significant part by foreign governments who have their own regional interests, their own strategic rivalries, and their own agendas that may or may not align with what is genuinely good for the American people. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is reported, documented fact, and it matters enormously because when you try to understand what America is actually trying to achieve in this war, what the exit looks like, what victory means, and who ultimately pays the price, you have to account for the interests of all the actors who pushed this thing into motion. The joint US-Israeli campaign evolved from initial strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of senior military figures into sustained large-scale air operations across Iran, with hundreds of strikes recorded in at least 26 of Iran's 31 provinces, with Tehran as the most heavily targeted location. Now, killing a nation's supreme leader in a surprise strike during the middle of ongoing nuclear negotiations, that is not a surgical operation. That is not a targeted counterterrorism strike. That is regime decapitation. And Iran, predictably, responded the way any nation would respond when its leadership is assassinated and its cities are being bombed. It struck back. In retaliation, Iran launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at targets in Israel and at US military bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. the conflict spread horizontally, exactly as strategic analysts had warned it would. Iranian strikes targeted U.S. embassies and military installations across the Gulf: UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, and Jordan. NATO forces struck down Iranian drones and missiles near the Incirlik air base in Turkey. Lebanon's Hezbollah, which had been observing a fragile ceasefire since 2024, was pulled back into the fight. The violence in Lebanon displaced hundreds of thousands, and by the end of the second week of the war, oil prices had surpassed $112 per barrel, the highest since 2022. And now, more than 30 days into this conflict, we are at a moment of extraordinary and genuinely dangerous uncertainty. Trump has threatened to blow up and completely obliterate Iran's electric plants and oil wells if a deal to end the war is not reached. He is openly floating the possibility of seizing Krai Island, the hub through which roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports flow. The Pentagon is reportedly preparing options for ground operations in Iran, while 3,500 additional U.S. soldiers arrived in the Middle East aboard the USS Tripoli. And yet, simultaneously, diplomatic channels remain technically open. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff indicated he expected meetings with Iran and was waiting for Tehran's response to a 15-point peace plan. Trump claimed Iran had agreed to most of the demands, but Iran's tone tells a different story entirely. A senior Iranian security official told CNN that Tehran will determine when the war ends, signaling that Iran is prepared to sustain offensive operations for an extended period, directly pushing back on U.S. assessments that the conflict could be wrapped up within weeks. That is not the statement of a government preparing to surrender. That is the statement of a government that has calculated, perhaps rightly, that time is on its side, that the economic and political costs of this war for the United States and its allies will ultimately make this adventure unsustainable. Iran has done this before. It is a civilization that thinks in centuries, not news cycles. Now here is where the story becomes even more complex, and where most American commentary simply drops the ball. Because while Washington is consumed by the Middle East, while its military assets are deployed, its diplomatic bandwidth is exhausted, its intelligence resources are stretched, and its public attention is locked onto the Strait of Hormuz, China has been watching with extraordinary discipline and extraordinary calculation, and China has not been passive. It has been sending signals, clear, stark, unambiguous signals about Taiwan that deserve far more attention than they are currently receiving. In a phone call on February 16, 2026, Xi Jinping warned Trump directly against fulfilling a $20 billion arms sale to Taiwan, threatening that doing so could upend Trump's planned visit to Beijing. Read that again. The leader of China called the President of the United States and told him, before a planned diplomatic summit, that if Washington continued its arms transfers to Taiwan, the meeting would be cancelled. That is not a polite diplomatic protest. That is leverage being applied at the highest possible level, and it appears to have worked, at least temporarily, because the United States was reported to be hesitating over whether to fulfill the arms sales to Taiwan out of concern that it could derail the Beijing visit. This dynamic illuminates something that the American public needs to understand very clearly. The Trump administration is not operating from a position of consistent strategic clarity on Taiwan. It is improvising, deal-making, and calculating, often in real time, what the United States can trade away in order to gain something else. And Taiwan, in this calculus, is a bargaining chip. Taiwan's absence from the United States' newly released 2026 National Defense Strategy has fueled fresh debate on the island. The omission is in sharp contrast with earlier editions of the Pentagon's flagship strategy, which had explicitly referred to Beijing's pressure on Taiwan 8 times in its 2022 version. Taiwan was simply removed from the document entirely. That is not an oversight, that is a signal. It tells Beijing something, it tells Taipei something, and it tells everyone watching what direction American policy is actually drifting. China's 2026 annual government work report changed the phrase "oppose Taiwan independence" from previous versions to "crack down on Taiwan independence," more combative language that reflects the PRC's expanding coercive efforts against Taiwan since the election of President William Lai Ching-te. This linguistic shift matters. In Chinese political communication, the precision of language carries enormous weight. When Beijing shifts from opposing something to cracking down on it, it is signaling an escalation in intent and a hardening of position. It is telling the world that the tolerance for the status quo has narrowed, and it is doing this precisely at a moment when the United States is militarily entangled in the Middle East and diplomatically distracted by a shooting war that has no clear end in sight. China's 2026 defense budget was proposed at approximately $278 billion, a 7% increase compared to 2025. Even as China's domestic economy faces headwinds, even as its GDP growth slows, it is investing more in military capability, not less. It is reading the strategic environment and making decisions accordingly. And the strategic environment right now is one in which American power is visibly strained, American alliances are fraying. Trump himself expressed deep disappointment with NATO's response to the Iran war, accusing the alliance of failing to support Washington despite years of US military spending. And American credibility as a security guarantor is being openly questioned from Taipei to Tokyo to Seoul. There is a school of thought, and I think it is worth taking seriously, that China does not necessarily want conflict with Taiwan right now. The US intelligence community's 2026 assessment indicated that Beijing prefers to achieve unification without the use of force and recognizes that an amphibious assault would carry a high risk of failure, especially if the US intervenes. But there is a significant difference between not wanting conflict today and not pursuing the conditions for leverage and control tomorrow. What Beijing is doing right now is investing in coercion. It is investing in the capacity to make Taiwan's situation more and more untenable without necessarily firing a single shot, through economic pressure, through military signaling, through cognitive warfare, through diplomatic isolation, and through the steady erosion of the American security guarantee that has kept the Taiwan Strait from becoming a war zone for 7 decades. ISW analysts found dozens of automatic identification system signals of Chinese Coast Guard vessels that had intermittently appeared and disappeared at the mouth of the Tamsui River in New Taipei, Taiwan, a form of signal spoofing that analysts described as a cognitive warfare effort to degrade Taiwan's threat awareness. This is not conventional military activity. This is psychological, informational, and operational pressure being applied below the threshold of armed conflict. It is precisely the kind of activity that doesn't generate headlines, but that steadily shifts the strategic reality on the ground. And here is the deeper, more uncomfortable truth that ties all of this together. When the United States chose to launch a war against Iran, a war that is now over a month old, that has killed thousands of civilians, that has created one of the worst energy shocks in modern history, that has strained alliances, exhausted diplomatic capital, and drawn the United States into a conflict with no clear exit strategy. It did so in a global context where China was already watching, already calculating, already looking for windows of opportunity. Analysts noted that the escalating attacks on Iran and the possibility of thousands of US troops being deployed to the region could draw attention and resources away from security in Asia. That is not a marginal concern. That is the central strategic question of this moment. The energy crisis that has followed the Iran war is real and worsening. Oil prices surpassed $112 per barrel. The IEA agreed to release a record 400 million barrels of crude oil in response, and Trump himself suggested the US would benefit from rising prices since it is a major energy producer, despite the increasing costs for American consumers and the risk of accelerating inflation. Think about that statement carefully. The President of the United States, during a war that his administration started, suggested that rising oil prices are actually good for America because we are a producer. But American families are paying those prices at every gas station, at every grocery store, in every utility bill. The benefits of high oil prices flow to energy companies and producing states. The costs are borne by ordinary working Americans who did not vote for this war and who were not asked whether they wanted it. Foreign ministers from Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia gathered in Islamabad to hold talks aimed at ending the conflict, which had entered its 30th day. Iran agreed to allow 20 Pakistani-flagged vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz, a small opening in what has otherwise been a near-total blockade of one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. These diplomatic efforts are real and they matter, but they are happening in the shadow of a conflict that has already reshaped the regional order in ways that will outlast any ceasefire. Iran's leadership has been decapitated. Its military infrastructure has been devastated, its civilian population has been traumatized, and its successor government, whoever that turns out to be, will emerge from this experience with a deep generational wound in its relationship with the United States that will define Iranian foreign policy for decades. The idea that America can bomb a country into becoming a friendly, stable, pro-Western state has now been tried enough times in enough places that we should be able to evaluate it empirically. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and now potentially Iran. The track record does not inspire confidence. And yet here we are again, with American firepower reshaping a country from the air, while the architects of the campaign speak about regime change and a better future for the Iranian people. The same Iranian people whose children were just bombed in schools, whose hospitals were struck, whose infrastructure is being systematically destroyed. Iran said nearly 10,000 civilian sites were damaged in US and Israeli attacks. The most jarring single incident was the bombing of a girls' school in the southern city of Minab, which Iranian officials say killed more than 170 people, mostly children. I want you to sit with that number, 170 children, in one school, in one city, and this is the war that is being prosecuted in your name, with your tax dollars, by your government. That is not an abstraction, that is a moral reality that every American citizen has a right and a responsibility to grapple with honestly. And while all of this is happening, while American power is being spent and stretched and tested in the deserts and mountains of the Middle East, the most significant long-term strategic challenge the United States faces, the contest with China for global primacy, is being shaped by what Beijing is observing and learning. China will likely closely study tactical and operational lessons learned from the conflict, as it has done with Ukraine. Every Chinese military planner is watching how American precision weapons perform, how Iran's air defenses responded, how the Strait of Hormuz was used as a strategic lever, how the United States manages its alliance relationships under pressure, and how American domestic politics reacts to a sustained, costly military campaign. These are lessons that will be absorbed, analyzed, and incorporated into Chinese strategic planning for years to come. The world that emerges from this moment, from the Iran war, from the China-Taiwan pressure campaign, from the fracturing of NATO cohesion, from the energy shock and its economic consequences, will be a fundamentally different world than the one we inhabited just 6 months ago. The question for America is whether its leaders have a coherent vision for that world, whether they understand the second and third order consequences of what they are setting in motion, whether they are capable of distinguishing between the short-term satisfaction of military action and the long-term interests of the American people and the global order that has, for all its imperfections, kept major power conflict at bay for 8 decades. That is the question that this moment demands. And it is a question that every American who cares about the future of this country should be asking loudly, clearly, and without apology.